Welcome to Community Matters. My guest in the studio this morning is Tom Godwin from the organisation First Light. Tom, great to have you in the studio. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to see you. I think I first met you when you were with another organisation.
Yes.
But you're still based, First Light is based in Plymouth, isn't it?
So we have an office in Plymouth, but we cover Devon and Cornwall, Swindon and Wiltshire and the Isles of Scilly. But yeah, we have various services in Plymouth and an office here. And we've been in the city for a long time. We used to be Twelves Company before we merged. So some of your listeners
Company.
So may remember that was set up in the city. But we've been going about 28 years, all told. So,
and tell us a little bit about your role and a little bit about the organisation itself.
So I have the very fancy title of Head of Development, which sounds very exciting. But ostensibly, what it is we are a charity that works with people who've experienced sexual violence and domestic abuse of all ages and all genders across the footprint that I've already mentioned. So we operate different services and very much kind of set up as an organisation to try and do a number of things. Obviously help those who really need it, who come to us often, having experienced something really life-changing. But part of my work, which is really kind of at the forefront of what I want to do, is that kind of what I call educate and prevent, which is kind of, we absolutely recognise through our day-to-day work the extent of the problem and the experience that it creates for people and the life-changing kind of outcomes and experience that is for those people and their truth. And that's and we have a lot of work we do around that. But I think we are all minded that actually to really make change happen kind of societally and around these problems in these areas, the work that we need to carry out is further up the river. There's always going to be a role to pull people out of the stream when they're in crisis, and that's absolutely right, and those services exist. But I think part of kind of being a sort of a more medium-sized kind of charity, we have over 150 staff working for us. We kind of deliver a range of services. We've got that kind of expertise to go out and try and say, so what? There's this problem, we need to speak more about it and do more, and we're here having this conversation today about it, which is really great. That's the first part of that. But then what do we do around giving people the tools to be able to do some of the kind of, not the heavy work, but actually play their part in kind of, being a responsible member of society and tackling some of the root causes of these problems and kind of what that looks like and how that works. So I kind of lead on things like fundraising to be able to do that. I run a training department where we go out and sell training into commercial spaces, firms that want to understand how to spot the signs or how to report, how to look after staff. Because, the reality is that many people who experience kind of these issues, the effect on their lives, the changes they have to make and the experience of their mental health and well-being is significant. So the cost to the economy, the cost to businesses, and organisations are starting to get their heads around, actually, it's all very well and good to say you've got a well-being champion and you prioritise mental health. But, if 1 in 3, 1 in 4 persons in your organisation may have experienced these issues, actually, stress in the workplace is only one element you need to deal with. This is another.
So we spoke off air a little bit, and we discussed the fact that the cameras aren't working. Anybody watching this on the podcast, you'll see that the cameras aren't working brilliantly. That's the operator, and we'll sort that out now. There you go. When we were talking off air, you mentioned that it's right across the board. The stereotype is, it's a working men's problem that's perpetrating sexual violence against women. Seems to be a common misperception. Is that something that's changing?
So I think there's a number of core misconceptions. I mean, I think that absolutely, and the campaign that we launched recently called They Think It's All Over was born out of this, which is that absolutely we saw a focus during the European Football Championships around the experience of women in domestic abuse settings while the football's on, whether England win and lose. The experience for women will be horrendous in those situations. But I think, and absolutely some great work happening in that space. There's some fantastic organisations in the city of Plymouth working in women-only space around domestic abuse and addiction and kind of recovery part, and we work very closely with them. What we're doing, I think is important, and there's an absolute place in it, is saying always, as an all ages and all genders service, and what that looks like in 2024, is that we have to recognise that kind of wherever there are people, and I use people in the tense, we see these problems. We do, day in, day out. And actually, part of the extent of the problem is that there is a perception amongst certain groups that, well, this doesn't, I don't engage in this kind of difficult behaviour, therefore it's the football fans down the road that I saw on that campaign. And actually that takes responsibility away from those people understanding in their communities, in their spaces, and in their kind of lives, the role they can play in being better upstanders, but also in terms of conversations. I was struck recently by an exercise I did at a conference whereby men were asked to hear from women in the room around the proactive steps they take about getting into taxis and taking photos of number plates, sending messages to their friends about the name of the driver or what time they've got in. One person spoke about leaving their fingerprints and a strand of their hair on the seat just in case something happens to them, so their DNA was in the vehicle. And I was struck by the fact that many men in the room didn't realise that experience. Now, that's part of it, and in agenda wise, but there's also a fact that other people are don't feel able to express things that have happened to themselves. And one of the misconceptions we hear regularly is that men who have been who have experienced some kind of childhood sexual violence or trauma will go on to be perpetrators. And that's quite a common myth. And we don't see a strong correlation at all in that area. And we need to be really careful that actually, just because you have had an adverse childhood experience like that doesn't mean you are going to go on to be a perpetrator. And we need to understand that the power dynamics in people and relationships, communities, family settings, that actually the kind of what we would call in the modern day world safeguarding has to be paramount. We need to be better at having a conversation around what being a responsible young person in going into relationships is, and also kind of our role in families and communities and workplaces around spotting the signs and asking people if they need help.
Having a conversation is what we really want to do with you, Tom. So that's a good place to leave that. We'll just take a break. We'll be back with Tom. Go anywhere. Back to hear more from Tom Godwin right after this. Tom, this topic, we could go really deep with this, and I don't think that'd be appropriate for the morning slot that we've got. And I know that you can go really deep with people, and your organization can really help people. So there can be a much more deeper and wider understanding that we can maybe get across in this program, just for the sake of people listening to this. But let's unpack a little. You said to me off air that it's very often, although things happen within institutions and in different settings, for most people, it's people that they know. It's these difficult situations happen to people in relationships where they know people.
Absolutely. There's, it is absolutely true that the majority of violence is perpetrated by men against women in that kind of setting. But there is absolutely, there are other dynamics within that, and there are, absolutely victims of other genders, and there are within other communities, but within other settings. And actually, whilst, often the very kind of random attacks that happen often make the news, a lot of the work that gets carried out by organisations such as ourselves, day in, day out, of people who are known to each other, people who are perhaps starting relationships that seem to be going well, and then perhaps end up in what you would consider very coercively being controlled, financial manipulation, power struggles within that. And that speaks a lot to the kind of very varied dynamics around domestic abuse and how that perpetrates. And, that is people who often don't understand perhaps that they are in those relationships, and or there is a point where they suddenly experience something, or there is a break point where that becomes they are aware, or they seek help, or they have to. For some people, they go their whole lifetime without knowing about it. And I think we are seeing a rise in the number of older persons coming to see us across our services. Before 1991, kind of when the law changed, the dynamics of what was acceptable or allowed under the law in marriage was very different. So for some people, they grew up in literally a different time legally. So when they say that, and a younger generation say, well, that's no excuse. I'm not making excuses ever, because, perpetrator is at fault. It's never the victim's fault. But I think it's really important to understand that, wherever we see people, as I've said before, we see these issues in all settings. And I think to combat and to do something about it as people, who are kind of active and want to be kind of upstanders in society, we have to understand that it is not one person or one organization or one area or one community's problem, and therefore we look to them to fix it. It's actually beholden on all of us. And people then say to me, well, what does that look like? How do you do that? And actually it starts with your behaviors and the way you interact with people, the way you look after, people close to you, the way you are inclusive, the way you don't, engage in banter, the way you don't make bad behaviors okay. And that can be in the workplace, that can be in, and for many of us, that is the way we are. But there are, power dynamics in which people thrive and exhibit behaviors, and it can start, and people find this still now baffling, but it starts with kind of that kind of behavior, and where it can lead, and what you called the pyramid of kind of, it starts with this kind of making jokes like that, consuming various content on the internet. And we speak to people who are raising young children around what to consume on the internet and how to challenge these narratives. It is a complex world, it is difficult. But I think, understanding about having courageous conversations, talking about things like consent and kind of appropriateness and good behavior and setting examples and being inclusive might seem like a very small drop in the ocean for something whose bigger problems we're talking about, but it starts with good behaviors and setting expectations and holding people to account who, in your social groups or in your settings, behavior that doesn't seem right. If you don't feel it's right and you challenge it and call it out, you are doing something proactive. And we all have a role to play in that.
There's a whole load of jump off points on what you just said for other questions. And social media is full of these conversations now. Some of it very helpful, some of it very social media. And let's not go quite down that road. How to help the situation from your perspective with First Light, what are some of the glaring misconceptions or grey areas that you could demystify? And so it'd be really good if people just understood this, would really go a long way, because you must address things like that in your training of different organizations.
Absolutely. I think one of the things we are acutely aware of is that people with children of teenage years perhaps feel that because of the internet and because of the modern world, that their children understand all these issues. I was sat the other day with a victim survivor who's been doing some fundraising for us, who, until the Sarah Everard murder, had never felt that she truly understood what had happened to her 3 years previously had not been okay. And in that moment, she comes from, she lives in the city, she was at mainstream education, all the opportunities of a young person, all the kind of things around her that people would say, surely she would understand, but she didn't. And in that moment, she went and sat down and told her parents, which is a hugely courageous thing to do. And in that moment, she went and sought some help and kind of some therapy that we offer through our Plymouth Therapeutic Service. But there is a misconception that younger people absolutely know these things, and therefore as parents or carers or people in the community, we don't necessarily have to do any of that talk, because none of us like talking about these issues. No one likes to have the chat around, safety and responsibility and things like that, raising children or being in an educational setting, or all these things. I mean, they are difficult things to do. But the problem is in that difficulty, people who want to perpetrate and play in the margins are given even more license to.
That is a good place to stop. Don't go anywhere. We're back with Tom Godwin right after this. Tom, it's becoming apparent just from this interview, one of the themes that's coming out is have the conversations, create a space where it's safe, where conversations can be had. So victim survivors, you called one, that's a phrase you've used, finding the other experiences that they see in the media or hear elsewhere, give them the confidence to say, hang on, something isn't quite right in my experience. So having an open conversation seems incredibly effective. Coming back to the work of First Light, how do you facilitate that in your work going into organizations and wider afield? Do you facilitate that kind of culture?
So yeah, we absolutely do. We've just launched a training offer to go into sort of organizations and businesses and we've been doing various bits of different training while we've launched it, and we've got it accredited, so it's part of people's HR, in their CPD. They could, work and things that, it's important. But I think one of the things within it is around what we call courageous conversations, and about understanding that if somebody is going to divulge something to you or share or point to an experience they've had, how you react in that moment is very important. But actually, even in your personal settings, you don't have to have been on some training to understand. There's a couple of really key things for your listeners to understand, that actually telling people if they come to you and they say something or is worrying, that it's not their fault, that what happened to them is the fault of somebody else and therefore they're not to blame, is an incredibly powerful way of validating somebody's experience and making space safe for them to share. But it's also absolutely crucial, because those people will feel, for whatever reason, over many years or perhaps a short period of time, or whatever their truth is, that they are not that they are at fault, they are to blame. And the victim blaming dynamic is incredibly powerful. It's crushing. It can take some people, they never get to a point where they can share, and or it comes very late in life, especially amongst men that we work with. But I think being able to have a courageous conversation, be a good active listener, these are all good skills generally, and also never diminishing someone's experience by trying to explain it away. Somebody's talking about a problem they've had, or an experience they've had that they don't feel is okay, and they've come to you. The courage that they have done to share in that moment with you is hugely, is not to be underestimated. Your response is to be a good listener, to be a welcoming space, like you would want to be treated, but to try and do something in that moment whereby you validate what's happened to them in a way, and try and empower them to to either go and get some help with it, or understand, or ask them what they want you to help them with doing that. People say, I never know what to do when someone's told me that. It's not your job. Your job is to then ask, feel free to ask back, say, now, what can I help? Like, what can we do? What would you like to do? What do you want to just have told me and sit with me? Do you want me to help you find a service to go and do? And there's a range of services across Plymouth for various different audiences and catering, or do you want to go and report that to the police? And for some people, it might just be, they might need to go and think about it. For some people, the fact that you've asked that might prompt them to know that you feel invested and that they can come to you again. And for some people, that might be the end of the conversation. And all of those things are fine. And you need to look after yourself in that, and you need to understand what you do with that, and sit with it and all those things. But absolutely. And I think, we are very good at saying that we prioritize kind of, talking about mental health and things like that, but when we look at the stats, the number of people who experience these issues, this is happening out and about every day of the week, and the impact on people's lives and in our work settings and in our families, homes, and in our communities is not to be underestimated.
Yeah. And when you're talking about, so if we talk about sexual violence or violence towards women, it's not the big headline grabbing things all the time, is it? Because I know it was really eye-opening for me. People that I know, as they went through their teenage years, girls saying, look, this is my experience on a bus.
Yeah.
And it's not the big headline grabbing things, is it always? It's because people may be listening thinking, oh, I only had a little thing that's happened to me. Surely that's not what we're talking about here. It's a bit broader, the spectrum of things that actually can cause us problems. Absolutely.
Sexual assault doesn't have to just be, the very sharp end of sexual violence. It comes in many forms, sexual harassment, kind of being made to feel unsafe, unwelcome attention, being sent, messages, picture messages that you didn't ask for consent to, having your image shared. They're multi-layered now. It's multi-dynamic, but you're absolutely right. The kind of, the experience of people, as younger women, perhaps, or even, on the bus, in previous generation is now replicated in the modern generation of what they get received in their DMs on Instagram. Do you know what I mean? But the dynamic's the same. The behavior is still happening. It is still out there. And actually, my question always is on that, is that actually, what is the role of people who are on the bus around you to make you feel safe? Because for some people, they don't feel able to challenge that behavior. They don't feel comfortable. They don't feel safe. But actually, most of the time, there'll be other people who witness that. And we all have a role to play in being better bystanders. and in challenging and calling out harmful behaviours. And some people, they don't feel safe and able to do that, but actually, hopefully there's other people around to do that. And if you see that happening, if you're playing sport in a team and there's some locker room banter, call it out, because often what we see with people is they start with that kind of behaviour. I have to say, when we see and we work with cases where there's a perpetrator, it is never the first time, hardly ever. These things don't happen out of the blue. People don't wake up one morning and go and do it. There's a pyramid, there's an escalation of things. And we see, and actually some people have been allowed to feel that their behaviour is okay and it's gone unchallenged. And we all have a responsibility. There's recourse, there's a criminal system for some people that doesn't work and it's not appropriate. But we need all aspects of our kind of society to be better at holding people to account for these kind of behaviours and calling out what's not right, and where we see it, making it so it's not okay. And that starts in our workplace, in our homes and our communities.
We'll come back to that, Tom. Don't go away. We'll hear more from Tom Godwin on this right after this. Tom, conversation, clearly, and you said courageous conversations, which I think is a brilliant phrase. It really encapsulates it. That involves the listener as well as the person taking the bold step to have the conversation. Something that's come to my mind, you've clearly said that having an experience in the past won't necessarily link you to worse things for yourself in the future. One of the examples you gave us, it doesn't mean you're likely to become a perpetrator. Yep. That myth has been dispelled. However, those things do stay in us if they become a trauma in our experience, if they stick there, and they can affect us later. Did you mention you'd encountered somebody for whom a difficult situation had happened as far ago as the Second World War, and what was that like?
So we work with a range of ages in our kind of sexual violence therapy service, and I think what you speak to there is really important, that people hold trauma and deal with it in different ways. And actually, when we see people in our communities and our lives and our work experiencing kind of a difficult period or behaviors that you find challenging, or we see people kind of recovering from addiction issues or falling in and out of jobs or broken relationships, there's often our go-to or our societal norm is to try and address obviously the sharp end of that problem in the moment, but often a lot of it is that kind of vicarious trauma that people are living with or holding, and for some people they're never going to be able to feel comfortable or able to share that truth. And it's absolutely right, we see it takes on average between 35 to 40 years for a man to come forward and talk to us about their experience of sexual violence being perpetrated against them. Now, in that time, their range of experiences and things that have happened to them in their lives that may or may not have been affected by that can be quite huge. I've spoken to some of them, broken relationships, addictions, problems at home or livelihood. Some people, they bury those things very deep and make a life for themselves, and in doing that take some power back. For some people, they find other coping mechanisms and strategies. But I think we have to recognise that, and that's not just men, some women, there is a sort of, again, a misconception that, younger women are more likely to come forward and talk to us about these issues than, because they're these issues are more prevalent. But there's still people who, for large periods, don't feel for the guilt and the shame. The power dynamics we don't just see in sexual violence, you see it in addiction and recovery, you see it in all sorts of areas of life. We are human beings, complex and gloriously so in ways. But I think it's really important that around kind of understanding that if people in your lives or people you come across have felt the courage to kind of share, that you can, if the time is right or they feel able to, try and explore with them that there is help out there available, that actually just because something happened to you a long time ago doesn't mean you should have to sit with it. Actually, and it's not on you to have to be that therapist. There are services that exist out there. There are things out there. There's an awful lot of self-help material, really good, from organisations such as ourselves, but others in our space, out there on websites and things like that. Because actually, for some people, it might just be a chance to say something and move on. For some people, it might be the start of a whole period of their life where they want to do the work in understanding what happened to them wasn't okay and what that means to them, and taking charge of that. And that's really important. And that's why therapy services exist that do, and they are vital. And, we kind of, we hold large amounts of caseloads on them, and in an ideal world there'd be more funding and more of them available. But ostensibly, although they're busy, and always could do more funding, they are not as busy as they should be in. Because if the number of people who are dealing with those problems, and it's like anything, my heart breaks around the fact that there are people who are sitting with these things, trying to deal with them on their own, because they feel that is beholden on them, that society, it's not okay to be that. And so my what if to ourselves is all the time, what more can we do to have conversations like we're having today and bring stuff out in the open, even at a time like tea time on the radio? And as challenging as that is, it is. If this one person thinks I'm going to try have a conversation at home, or one person says, help me to understand what happened to me isn't okay, or one person says to their partner, I understand it must be very different for you because, you're a woman, I'm a man, or that you come from a community whereby you've experienced this, or do you know what I mean? Or I don't think this is somebody in our life. I don't think what's happening to them might be okay. And if it leads to one of those courageous conversations, this has been worth having. And it's difficult and as upsetting as this might be for some people to listen to. And it's challenging for some people who think this isn't their problem. And that's fine. I understand that. And for some people, this is become very defensive about this. And I understand that. But if for one person could maybe put themselves in someone else's shoes and think, what could I do? How could I respond? Or what kind of conversation could I have? But also to know that even if they just know that's out there and there are people doing this work, and so it may not happen, you may have no one in your life that this affects right now or understands. But someday, one day, something might get said or heard, or you might see something and you might think to yourself, I could do something. I could be a bit of a bystander here and do something courageous, but important. And it starts with those small acts.
That's great, Tom. Don't go away. I keep saying that on this interview because I don't want you to go away. We'll be back and hear more from Tom Godwin right after this. Tom, as we're talking, something's coming to my mind. Because we've talked about the person the example of someone 60, 70, 80 years ago could have gone through something that still they've carried that trauma, and it's relevant for them to talk it through now if they can find somebody. Things have changed. So I grew up in the 70s, and I sometimes watch 70s things with my kids, and I'm like, oh my goodness, we did that, we said that. And obviously from their context, they're like horrified. So obviously there's been a big shift in the way that culture is and society are looking at issues to do with the way we treat each other right across the board, and particularly in areas that we would have said in the 70s, or would have been said, a bit of banter is okay, and it's like, clearly no, it's not okay. And you've described that trajectory from it can start there, and then people become more and more inured to that situation, and something quite nasty develops. Having said all of that, which is a terrible question because it isn't a question, are you hopeful? Do you see that things are changing for the better at all in society?
So I think it's a really good question. And I think, it's really important to understand that, COVID, there was a big focus, rightly, when people were suddenly not literally stuck at home, that there was a big focus in our sector and the government and funding around domestic abuse, and rightly so. And and there's a lot of work done in that period. Problem is, I am hopeful because we're having conversations like this and we need to do more of them. But it is a ongoing conversation. It is not a one hit. You have a new government who announced that the violence against women and girls is a national crisis and a government priority, which is welcomed. But absolutely wouldn't be doing our work any justice without saying that where, as I've said, where all people and all genders and all ages, and lots of organisations in the city. And that said, there is a huge amount of work going on. Plymouth is a kind of leading city around a violence against women and girls strategy that came off the back of the sad events around Bobby Ann's murder. There's some amazing organisations working in the city collaboratively on all sorts of various things, whether it be male allyship with man culture, kind of having conversations in male-dominated spaces around how men can be better allies, whether it be, you know, the likes of First Light working, offering our therapy services, whether it be people like Trevi kind of operating kind of women only addiction recovery, and mother and baby and kind of their services. And you know, there's domestic abuse services, all sorts of people working in this area, which is really important. It's good for listeners to know that that's out there, and you know, you contact people, you will find the right help you are, and that there's, you know, it's been taken seriously. But it comes back to what we said, I think, earlier on in this interview, which is that conversation has to be ongoing. It's about creating safe spaces to have courageous conversations at home and work, around, you know, in your communities and in your family settings, and understanding the role we all play, and that language is important, and that, you know, absolutely what wasn't right in the 1970s is certainly not right now, but actually, you know, we still have work to do. And that can feel an uncomfortable space for some people.
Yeah.
And also for other people who feel that this is not their experience. They're not engaged in harmful behaviours themselves, and they don't know anybody. This is someone else's problem. But ultimately, like all things in society, we have a role to play. And I think, you know, we've got to keep going, and we've got more to do. We would like to see more organisations be proactive in their workspaces about sharing messaging and bringing some of these uncomfortable things into talking about them, because I think we've proved in the studio today, you can talk about these issues, you can understand the depth of them in a format that is accessible for people at the time of day that we are, but also give tips and pointers and have a conversation about what we all do, rather than it just be, this is the problem. And it's absolutely important to raise awareness of the problem. But I think with the work that we all need to do more on is how we support each other to do it. And also, it is okay not to know. It is okay to go, blimey, I don't really understand that. What would I do? And to help, but also to understand that it is not one person's responsibility to have the answers. It's not one organisation's responsibility to fix everything. It is beholden on all of us.
And to that point, First Light as an organisation, you've mentioned you do offer a therapy service, and you do offer training into organisations.
Yeah.
Unpack a little, or at least give us an indication. How could somebody connect with that? So someone who thinks, this is just coming out of my experience now, I need to talk with somebody. But also the other person who's like, I really don't know how to handle this, and I know some people. Could you help?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is firstlight.org.uk, and we have obviously a range of social media where we put out, we run various campaigns throughout the year. Obviously, they think it's all over campaign is running it now, which is shining a light on the kind of stats and the examples around kind of how this happens in all sports, which is but off the back of that, we're sharing a load of material over what's called 16 Days of Action, which is a big campaign that happens internationally. We're sharing a load of materials around what we call Affected Others, which is like family members, people, video assets, packs, you know, wellbeing packs, videos about how to have courageous conversation, top 10 tips, worksheets, things about how to spot trauma, how to understand and talk about the guilt and shame complex I spoke about, self-help materials really, and we'll be sharing them throughout, and a lot of those things exist. But ultimately as well, there is the sharp end of the work we do, and there's your phone numbers on the website around, you know, if you're somebody in Plymouth and you experience these issues, or you're affected by what I've spoken about today and you need help, absolutely make contact and know that support is available in there.
That's great. Tom, that's been super helpful. We could talk for an hour on more and just scratch the surface. Yeah. So I hope you come back in again sometime in the future.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Give us the website address again.
firstlight.org.uk.
So that's where you go, folks, if you want to find out or engage any more. You're listening to the Community Matters program on Cross Rhythms. We're here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with music and life. I'll catch you next time on the show.